I'm Tobias Romer. I work with Olufsen Environmental. All three of us do. On the Invasive Spartina project, I manage the Spartina monitoring program. I have a big background in avian ecology from University of Arizona and UC Davis, and I did my graduate work on Ridgway's rails, partially at Arrowhead and other sites around the bay.
I was just gonna say, Rails. I am Jen McBroom. I am also working for Olufsen Environmental for the Invasive Spartina project. I'm the Ridgeways Rail Program Manager, and I've been working on this project for 20 years. Before that, I was working still in the salt marshes, looking at song sparrows and marsh wrens. So I've been getting muddy out in the marshes for a very long time. All right, Jeannie.
Hi, I'm Jeannie Hammond, and I also work for OEI. And as part of the Invasive Spartina project, I am in charge of the restoration program. Let's see, before I've also been with Olufsen Environmental for 20, maybe not 20, 18 years, almost as long as Jen. And before that, I worked for Point Blue Conservation Science, which back then was Point Reyes Bird Observatory. And I did my master's work in collaboration with them on songbird response to riparian restoration in the Central Valley. So doing habitat now, was doing birds before.
Habitat for birds.
And everything else. I mean,
Yeah. Um, okay. Well, I think that we could just jump into it. Thanks for coming, everyone. We are going to talk about Invasive Spartina project, kind of Invasive Spartina in and of itself and its impacts on the bay, uh, especially on some bird species and in San Leandro Bay, which I know is very dear to many of your hearts. I'm going to do some intro just on Spartina and kind of why we're here. And then Jen's going to talk a bit more specifically about the birds, and Jeannie's going to talk about the restoration. And then we can tie it all together and answer questions. I'm going to start us off with just kind of a reminder of the status of our wetlands in San Francisco Bay. Here we've got a map showing all of the tidal marshes that existed roughly 200 years ago. And then on the right shows where our tidal marshes are today. The lighter green are remnant marshes. The kind of more olivey ones are marshes that have been restored after development. And then the dark green ones are ones that are planning to be restored in the future. So roughly 85% of our marshes were lost in this period due to human development, largely for agriculture and commercial salt production, but also building things like airports and stadiums and neighborhoods. Um, so this would be going on for a long time. And then kind of mid 20th century, 70s, big conservation shift happened, and we realized that our wetlands are really important. And so we shifted focus, like we as the conservation community, shifted focus to prioritize wetland protection and restoration. And in 1999, even took that a bit further, set an explicit goal to get up to 100,000 acres of tidal marsh bay wide. We are a little bit over half of that right now. So there's still a lot of large scale restoration going on. So early restoration, tidal marsh restoration project started in the 70s and really great intentions, bring back the tidal marshes that had been converted for cattle grazing or salt production. And in order to help it, they brought in a plant from the East Coast Spartina alterniflora. It was brought in because it seemed like it may grow better. Um, and it did, compared to our native Spartina foliosa. But the big thing that happened was that the two then hybridized. And this is what kind of spawned this big problem and why the ISP is here today. By the 80s and 90s, big landscape scale uh, alterations to the bay were being observed. Mudflats were turning into big bands of grassland. Um, those urban flooding, all these things were starting to happen, and so it caught the attention of researchers and academics, primarily at UC Davis and UC Berkeley. And through a bunch of studies, they discovered kind of what was going on, that these guys had hybridized, and they identified the ecosystem threats that this hybrid would bring to the bay if left unchecked. So, what are those? The big ones are primarily that the hybrid Spartina, the invasive Spartina, I'll use that kind of interchangeably, grows in a broader range than any of our other native tidal marsh plants. It grows lower, it grows higher, and it grows really fast. It outcompetes all the other native plants, and so we lose all of that native floral diversity, and you just get a big monoculture of kind of like a big football field of this grass. It also spreads out onto the mudflats. That's a part of it growing lower. And, here in San Francisco Bay, an area of hemispheric importance for birds, especially migratory shorebirds, those tidal flats, that's their foraging habitat. And this grass takes it over. It changes the benthic invertebrate community. And then it's also just endangering our native cordgrass because it produces so much pollen. It'll pollen swamp the native, and all of the offspring are then more hybrids. And then they just grow faster than the native, and so it's actually threatening the very existence of this plant species. Um, Other two things that kind of impact humans a bit more, it increases flood channel, increases flood potential in urban areas because it can crowd out the flood control channels and natural creeks. But then it also ponds water, which can then work as breeding grounds for mosquitoes, which obviously has public health concerns. But largely, it undermines native tidal marsh restoration. All of these efforts that are going on around the bay, this plant threatens a lot of that. And there's a lot of groups working together to try and do this large scale restoration. So these things were identified, and a couple groups, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on the refuge and East Bay Park District, tried on their own to control this plant to get rid of it, and it just proved to be too big of a task. And so the ISP was born. We are a collective of our state lead is the California State Coastal Conservancy. You're meeting with Maryland next week. And then our federal lead is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And we work very, very closely with our NGO partner, the California Invasive Plant Council, along with tons of other partners around the Bay. But this is kind of the core team. The three of us, Jen, Jeannie, and I, are all with Olufsen Environmental. We are the primary contractor on this project. So, what do we focus on? Why is ISP really here? We've kind of touched on it, but just to put it kind of explicitly, is that we're protecting the tidal flats. We're protecting this shorebird habitat from being completely converted. Various research has been done showing impacts of the infestation and its modeled threat would lead to roughly 30 to 80% loss of all shorebirds in South San Francisco Bay. Obviously, we don't want to do that. So we're keeping these mudflats from being overrun and protecting shorebird habitat. We're also supporting these large scale restoration efforts that are going on as a part of this goal to get up to 100,000 acres of tidal marsh. Uh, Groups like the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project were formed, and we worked really closely with them. Uh, Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge is doing a lot of restoration on their own, and we're here to kind of safeguard these newly breached, restored tidal marshes from the invasive Spartina, without us kind of being this front line. It's generally the first plant that comes in, and the entire goal of these marshes to be big, native, beautiful, beautifully diverse marshes gets undermined, and you just get a big football field. And then finally, just protecting the native Spartina in and of itself. It is It is incredibly important. It's a keystone species for tidal marshes. Um, we do only have one native Spartina in San Francisco Bay. That is Spartina foliosa, or Pacific cordgrass, and it is incredibly abundant. It is widespread. Well over 99% of the Spartina in the bay is native, and it's good, and we want to protect it. It is abundant up in North Bay and South Bay. Unfortunately, it's not as abundant in Central Bay, but that's also because tidal marshes in and of themselves are not really all that widespread in Central Bay. But if we can get rid of the hybrid, we have opportunities to bring native foliosa back towards the Central Bay and help support those marshes. Uh, really quickly, how the native Spartina differs from the hybrid. We've mentioned this, but here's just a little schematic to visualize it. Here is an elevational gradient going from left to right of upland and high marsh all the way down to the subtidal zone. And these little orange bars kind of show where the native and where the invasive can grow. I see that the native is a fairly narrow band. It's generally relegated to the lower marsh, while the hybrid can grow all the way up in the high marsh, all the way down to the mudflat, to the edge of the subtidal. And it can do that really quickly. Um, so as it can occupy these broader ranges, it's outcompeting all the other plants that otherwise would be there, which is then in conflict with the other species that are reliant on those plants. Um, Here is a little visual of an uninvaded pickleweed plain. So this is kind of mid-marsh. You might be able to see in this very lower right-hand corner, there's a couple little sprigs of hybrid Spartina. And if or in this actual case, after 2 years of growth without being treated, it turned into this. Um, Not sure how well you could see it, but up here in the channel, it's growing down in the bottom of the channel. It's growing up here behind the Grandelia, so in like mid and a little bit higher marsh, and it's just overrunning this pickleweed plain altogether. So this is kind of what we're fighting. And the next few slides are just going to summarize the progress that we've made in the last 20 years. We began treatment bay-wide in 2005. And these maps are showing the distribution of hybrid over the last 20 years. So 2005, 2010, 2015, and 2025. If you blur your eyes, we don't need to get into details, but the dark red means that there's a whole lot of hybrid there. The dark green means that there's no hybrid there. Dark blue means that hybrid has been removed and it has not been found for at least 3 years. So you could just generally see that Central and South Bay were completely overrun in 2005. Fast forward to 2025, and there are some hot spots where we still have a good amount of hybrid, but most of it is trending a lot more towards the green. So we're getting rid of it. Uh, Unfortunately, if you can see this, two of these spots that are just overrun by hybrid are what we're talking about today. Two sites that you're very familiar with, Arrowhead Marsh and its neighbor, MLK New Marsh. So while we're trying to get rid of hybrid bay wide, we need to get rid of these big holdouts because those are then just pumping out seed everywhere, and areas and shorelines keep getting reinfested. And so we're scrambling to keep pace and to keep making progress getting rid of it. Uh, Here's same kind of thing, just showing it a little differently. This is timeline 2004 to 2025, showing that when we started treatment baywide, we had 805 acres around the bay, and we've been dropping that down now by 98%, down to 18 acres spread throughout in 18 acres in the entire estuary. Unfortunately, almost 30% of that is locked in Arrowhead Marsh and MLK New Marsh. These are currently the only two sites in the bay that we are not treating. And we know why. It's a complicated story, and rails are there. And so that's what we're talking about today. My last slide is just going to look at San Leandro Bay. These are kind of big blocky outlines, but these are all of our different sites in San Leandro Bay. And the red is showing where the hybrid Spartina is. And you'll notice that the eastern side of Arrowhead Marsh and all of MLK New Marsh are just very densely packed in with hybrid. These are the densest populations of hybrid in the bay, in the world, actually, because this plant doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Um, so unfortunately, though, in San Leandro Bay, the hybrid has already outcompeted most other native tidal marsh vegetation. So right now, vast majority of the vegetation at Arrowhead Marsh and MLK New Marsh is just the hybrid. If you get rid of the hybrid, there's not much other vegetation there. And we know that there are rails at these sites, and they're currently pretty dependent on the hybrid. So so how do we move forward? And that's what we are working on currently. We know it's a bit difficult. There's going to be, I don't know how else to put it, but kind of an ugly phase of Arrowhead Marsh and MLK because it's going to go through some transition, and we need a little bit of time before we can start getting native plants back in there, whether that's through passive uh, colonization and establishment, or if we're going to be actively planting stuff and help it along. Uh, I think I can stop there and pass it on to Jen to
Yeah,
talk about rails at these sites and Baywide.
sure. Yeah, this next slide, similar, it's a map of the same area, but now we're looking at rails instead of Spartina. Those white circles are the places that we heard rails and plotted them on a map. You could also see little X's in the background. Those are our survey stations where we listen for the rails. And these are all the rails that we detected in San Leandro Bay last year, 2025. The 2026 survey season just ended yesterday. So that data is not yet ready, but I think it's probably pretty similar. All those white dots are stacked on top of each other from three different visits to the site. So it's not all unique birds, but there's still a large density of rails at these sites. All right, you could advance the slide. Just wanted to talk a little bit about the Ridgeways rails at Arrowhead in particular. It is a super high density of rails, um, and unique in that there is another site in Central Bay that has an oddly high density of rails, given how small the site is. That's Steege Marsh in Richmond. Steege Marsh is a really great place to also go see rails. It's a native marsh. But similar to Arrowhead, it is a really productive marsh in a very urban environment. So that Central Bay problem strikes again. I think what's happening at these sites is that these rails are able to successfully reproduce and they're not getting depredated and they're making lots of babies, but they're not able to disperse. So when they get up to fly away, all they see is highways and airports, and then they go back and land right where they came from. And genetic work from USGS does indeed show that there's a high degree of kinship of the birds in San Leandro Bay at Arrowhead and MLK New Marsh, showing that they're all very related to each other. Otherwise, the populations really break along the Central Bay in the North and the South Bay, where their main populations are. All right, next slide. Oh, yeah. I wanted to talk about the different survey methods over the years and how we get these these numbers of birds in all these various sites. One of the older methods that is no longer in use, but maybe if you've been around for a while, you might remember East Bay Parks used to do high tide airboat surveys. So they would take an airboat shown here out during the king tides in the wintertime. And while the when the water is filling the whole entire marsh and the birds are hiding in a small area, they could count all the birds in these little small patches. It wasn't a great technique because it did expose the birds when they're most vulnerable. A different method that they use is 2-hour stationary surveys. So those Our uh, They had three biologists going out to Arrowhead, each sitting in the same spot for 2 hours, either at sunrise or sunset, and they recorded everything they heard in that 2 hour period. But birds move around a lot and they call from different locations, and it was very hard to interpret the data and it wasn't very standardized. We've also used passive point count surveys, not at Arrowhead Marsh, but at other marshes around the bay, where we just listen for 10 minutes. It's a traditional point count where you stand at one station for 10 minutes, listening for birds, recording everything you hear in that 10 minutes and move on. It's a little bit easier to interpret the data, but you have a reduced detection probability. And then ultimately, what we all use now is the North American Secretive Marshbird Survey Protocol, which is a mouthful, but we all adopted that back in 2017, and it is a standardized way of doing surveys so we can compare them over time and across regions. Okay, next slide. So this method, the North American Secretive Marshbird Protocol, was developed by Dr. Courtney Conway for the Yuma, it was then Clapper Rail, but it's used by wildlife managers across the whole entire country and even up into Canada at freshwater marshes and brackish marshes. They have a suite of rails that they are surveying for in all these marshes. The rails that we're focused on are ridgeways rails, of course, and block rails. Um, the protocol dictates that you have three visits over the course of the survey season, which is from January 15th to April 15th. That's when the birds are calling the most and most vocal, setting up their territories for the season. It's the same 10-minute call count along a transect. So you spend 10 minutes at one station, record everything you hear during that 10 minutes, and then move along down the transect to the next recorded point. These are the same transects and points year after year. The thing that makes the North American Secret and Record Protocol unique is that we use broadcast on every survey, every round, every station. And I think that the audio isn't going to work because we might not have set it up on Zoom. So we can't hear it, but Tobias can. It's a Ridgway's rail clatter, and Zoom always thwarts me when I try to put this in a presentation. Um, but we listen for them, and then based on what we hear, we use a compass to estimate the bearing and estimate the distance to the bird. We take all that data and we plot it on a map. And that's how we figure out where and how many birds there are. We could do the next slide. This is what Arrowhead looked like last year, our surveys last year. You can see there's a lot fewer dots now. We're zoomed in a little bit more. So you can see where our 4 survey stations are at that site. This is the results of our second round of survey. We got 30 birds during that round. That was the highest round. And that's what Arrowhead gets marked down at on the big bay-wide data set, that we heard 30 birds at that site because that was the round with the highest number of birds detected. All right, and next slide. This is once you put all that data together, Point Blue, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, us, we all collect our data into one common database. And we can use these call count surveys to see the trends over time and how rails are doing across the whole entire Bay Area. One thing I really want to point out is that these are call count numbers. So this is the number of birds that we're hearing. Not necessarily, there are more birds out there than we can detect. So the bulk of the population are in those like big North and South Bay marshes. That's where most of these birds come in. And these marshes are huge, and we can only survey like a tiny little corner of them during your 2 hour survey window. So maybe we're detecting like 15% of the birds in the marsh. So that 15% is here, but the rest of the marsh that we can't hear in is not represented in this graph. So that's just to say that this is like the bare minimum number that we definitely heard out there during each given year. And next slide. So one other cool thing that we can use that data for is to look at habitat associations. And Point Blue did that a few years back. They looked at where rails have higher densities and what are the habitat characteristics of those marshes. And they like big, large marshes, marshes with lots of room in the middle and only a little bit of edge on the outside. You can imagine that edge habitat is a place that predators can come in and enter the marsh, especially when the tides are high. So a big marsh with a wide variety of low marsh, mid marsh, and high marsh. Low marsh for foraging, mid marsh to hanging out, and high marsh for hiding nests and hiding at high tides. They like lots of channels, big channels, little channels, tiny channels. Some of the tiny channels get overgrown with vegetation, so they're almost like tunnels. And that's a great place for them to forage, but it's also how they connect habitat across the marsh. They use those to like little rail highways across the marsh. And then lastly, like really thick, tall and dense cover. So lots of veg all smushed in there. You can see that in the top right. That's like an example of some beautiful native tidal marsh habitat that rails just love. And on that note, I'm going to pass it off to Jeannie, who's going to tell you about what we're doing to make that veg happen.
Thanks, Jen. So yeah, I'm going to talk about our restoration program, which our program exists to support the inventory and treatment of invasive Spartina. So I just want to say that. We've been completing installations at different sites for 15 years, and we're planning our 16th year right now. And as Jen said, our whole program is really focused on ridgeways rails. So she showed you what really great, talked about really great habitat is for rails and how we support big populations. We're looking at it at a much smaller scale, trying to create these little patches of habitat at sites and providing propagules that will spread over sites over time and help jumpstart restoration. So some of the critical components that she talked about were cover, like habitat cover for predators while they're foraging and while they're nesting during nesting season, and as well as high tide refuge, which comes into play pretty significantly during those winter king tides. Another main goal of our program is to do really rapid habitat enhancement to promote marsh resiliency, both at sites where we've done a lot of invasive Spartina treatment. So we've knocked back the hybrid Spartina. We want to come in there and rapidly plant so that we can provide habitat cover for rail and other wildlife as quickly as possible. But also because we work in a lot of restoration sites, and we know that with sea level rise, what's going to be really helpful for marshes to be able to move, like migrate and or keep pace with sea level rise is the more vegetation they have, the more sediment they can trap. And when you trap sediment, that means you can increase your elevation over time. So rapid habitat enhancement to promote marsh resiliency in the long term. Thanks, Tobias. So where do we do it? The map on the left-hand side shows the sites where we've installed habitat enhancements in blue. And we also have some sites, both the blue sites and other sites where we've actually constructed high tide refuge islands. And I have a slide on those, so I won't talk about them right here too much. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you the zonation diagram for tidal marsh in San Francisco Bay or anywhere really. But I put some additional things on here to kind of point out where the rails are living and the kind of habitat enhancements that we're doing specifically. So low marsh foraging, the native plant that we have that will grow in most of San Francisco Bay in the low marsh with the higher salinities that we have is Pacific cordgrass. So planting Pacific cordgrass where appropriate to provide foraging cover. And then in the middle marsh, the marsh gum plant, like Joan was talking about, loves to grow along the edge of the sinuous marsh channels that birds like. So we want to get that in there so that they have habitat cover along channels. And then when you move up into the transition zone, slightly higher elevation, we're working with two different types of high tide refuge. One at existing marshes where we have transition zones. A lot of the transition zones around San Francisco Bay, unfortunately, are really disturbed because that's where all of our development has happened. So if they're vegetated, they have ruderal vegetation, meaning non-native annual plants like mustard. And so we want to come back in there and do habitat enhancement to provide like year-round perennial habitat cover for rails, other wildlife, and also, pollinators, everything, like a better habitat. The other type of high tide refuge is the constructed islands that I have a slide on specifically. And the idea there is in marshes where we don't have high tide refuge in the interior, that we're constructing small islands that will provide habitat during higher tides where there isn't any currently. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is a before after. This is Tobias referred to one of the large scale restoration efforts that's happening by many partners, South Bay Salt Pond Project. This is the Eden Landing Ecological Reserve. This is a complex of salt ponds that have been phase 1 is done, phase 2 is about to happen. Where they're being restored to tidal action, and we're going to get tidal marshes in the future. This entire complex, we knew, so site is at the right elevation for Pacific cordgrass, but was really no local source for native cordgrass anywhere near here. So we wanted to come in here and intensively plant Pacific cordgrass to get this jump started towards restoration, towards a mature marsh. And here's what it looks like years later. The cool thing about this particular marsh, North Creek Marsh, this was a salt pond, 0 habitat for rails. This year in 2026, we detected over 30. So it's working. Yay! Okay, next slide. This is another restoration site on the Hayward shoreline. I don't know, this would be behind the gates, that great Mother's Day. It might be, I'm not sure where they're going, but this is behind the gates at Hayward Shoreline. Actually, that's nearby because that's the roosting island. Never mind. Anyway, this is a restoration project where it did passively revegetate with perennial pickleweed, which is a great native plant. But in order to grow rails here, to have a rail population, we need more than the pickleweed. The pickleweed isn't tall enough or, heterogeneous enough habitat cover. So we came in here and intensively planted marsh gum plant along the Marsh Plain Channel. And this is kind of what it looks like now, although it's 2026. Anyway, you get the idea. And so Jen was talking about how the rails like to use these channels, these little sinuous channels. You can picture a rail down in the bottom of that channel, foraging down in there and then hopping up into the gum plant as the tide rises. Next slide. So I also talked about the marsh transition zone where we do plantings. And this is, you can kind of see in the background on the left side of this photo, there's the non-native annual weed that was basically this whole slope. So we've come in here and we're planting native perennial rhizonomous plants too. So plants that are going to grow clonally with the idea that these are more salt. We use more salt tolerant species. And that with climate change happening, we may have drought, we have drought years, we have wet years. Clonal plants can persist and they don't need to germinate every year from seed. So over time, they'll spread and hopefully self-perpetuate themselves, and we'll end up with a much better native mosaic. And this is showing what can happen. This is just one growing season with these native perennial rhizonomous species. And you will continue to see them spread across this site and create a really great tall habitat cover. Okay, high tide refuge islands. Why are we constructing them? USGS found through research that Ridgway's rails are most vulnerable in the winter, specifically during extreme high tides like king tides. The mortality was the highest. And so the idea with these islands is that out in these marshes where rail experts have identified that there isn't a lot of high tide refuge, in some places no high tide refuge, that we'll construct these islands. They're about 10 feet by 30 feet, so small footprint, but a rail pair in a territory, it's looking around as the tide rises, they're going to head for this island and hopefully find refuge there until the tide comes back down. They're constructed by hand by contractor crews, and they use local soil. So they basically mound up the soil and then replant it with the pickleweed sod that was in the location where the island was before. They salvage it, put it back on top, plant saltgrass into it, and then plant gum plant. And the idea there is that the island is constructed at the elevation where the gum plant is going to be sticking up out of the water, even at the highest predicted astronomical tides. So those king tides that we're worried about. And the 3 photos across the bottom are showing 3 different sites where islands have been constructed. And the one in the middle is showing you at a normal high tide, and you can see how much it's sticking up above the normal high tide. So you can envision that at a king tide, you are going to have gum plant cover. And these other two sites, you can really see how, wow, there's not much else around there for the rails to hide in during those king tides. Okay, next slide. So we're talking about San Leandro Bay. So I wanted to just kind of cover the habitat enhancements that we have installed and partners, other folks have installed too. Native cordgrass at LC Romer. This is the city of Alameda side of the shoreline. So looking east, and you can see that the native cordgrass has come in there. We planted it and then it's expanded, and it's a continuous small band where it's supposed to grow in the low marsh. It's not going up. It's not going down into the mud flats. We also have constructed 5 of the high tide refuge islands I just described at Arrowhead and MLK New Marsh, as well as planting native marsh gum plant at Arrowhead and Damon Marsh. And then in the Marsh Upland Transition Zone, Golden Gate Bird Alliance has done a really great job of enhancing the transition zone between Arrowhead and the upland, and Save the Bay, equally great job. MLK New Marsh and Damon Marsh and the sloughs over there. So there's been a lot of great work done in the transition zone. It's just a very small transition zone in San Leandro Bay. Future projects, there's a couple projects that are in the planning phases for San Leandro Bay. One's called Supply Bank, and the other one is a local community-led project by Sacred Spaces that's going to be enhancing habitat along the Bay Trail. But there are really limited opportunities in San Leandro Bay. For us, with our restoration program, the main problem is the threat from the hybrid Spartina that is still not controlled at Arrowhead and New Marsh. We can't do a lot of revegetation until it's under control, because there's just a really high risk of tidal marsh plants being reinfested, and basically we'll have to retreat them. So we can't do a lot until that hybrid Spartina is controlled. In addition, you guys are all familiar with San Leandro Bay. You know what it looks like. We've got the Oakland Airport, you've got the Coliseum. It's a very hard edge developed urban shoreline. So there's really limited opportunity for large scale habitat enhancement in the area. We also know all about sea level rise, and in San Leandro Bay, because of that hard edge, there's really no place for the small tidal marsh habitat that is there to migrate with sea level rise. Sea level rise scenarios show that Arrowhead Marsh is going to go underwater by 2050. So in order to preserve the habitat that we have in San Leandro Bay, there's going to have to be some really major restoration actions that happen to make that happen. Okay, next slide. Okay, so Tobias talked about how we're going to be moving towards treatment at Arrowhead and MLK New Marsh, so the last 2 sites that we have to go. And so we wanted to just provide an example of what we hope will happen. This is Cogswell, and Cogswell was not treated for a number of years, and you can see the hybrid Spartina that is in the background encroaching towards some of our plantings in the foreground. And this is showing 2018 because this is the year that we resumed treatment at this site. And combined with intensive revegetation, the intensive Spartina treatment followed by, or actually happening during, this is what the site looks like now. So Spartina treatment, intensive revegetation with gum plant, and we have a really nice looking marsh now. Next slide. And Jen provided this great slide, which shows you what was happening at the site. So 2018, we resumed Spartina treatment at the Cogswell Marshes. And this is showing you the rail population over time as treatment happened combined with revegetation. And in 2025, that's where the population is now. We don't have 2026 numbers finalized yet, so I can't show you that. Okay, so I wanted to, as our final slide, I wanted to zoom out and just talk about baywide restoration another time. Tobias showed you this slide, so you remember we lost 85% of our habitat, and the restoration and conservation community has this goal. We want to get to 100,000 acres. And the map on the right shows you the existing marshes, and then the medium, the olive green color is our restored marshes. And so I'm really plugging tidal marsh restoration here. We've done such a great job. We're up to 53,000 acres roughly. And the ISP is basically supporting all of this bay-wide restoration by making sure that we control hybrid Spartina so it doesn't get into these new restoration sites as they're opened, so they can develop as native tidal marshes. And so the red stars on here, I'm just showing you, these are sites where we have surveyors who survey the rail population there. And so remember, these were all, 20, 25 years ago. Some of them not even that long ago, 15 years ago, these were no habitat for rails. And at these sites, and these are just a sampling of the sites. And we also know, Jen explained that our surveys only actually tell us numbers in a portion of the site, not the whole site. So only 5. About 120 birds detected here in our current survey efforts. So tidal marsh restoration is working great for rails, and there's more and more sites coming online every year, and it's just really great to see. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. That's our last slide. And now questions. And there were a bunch of questions in the chat that I'm guessing nobody
Yes.
answered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I decided I was going to just wait because they were, I mean, I could have answered the first one, but the first question is from Edwin, do rails migrate? Or Ridgeway's rails? Well,
Actual suffering.
Oh, Jen, you're
I
muted.
think you are muted, Jen.
Well, you can answer the question
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
No, no, they disperse when but they don't do much migrating. They will move. I mean, Tobias did some telemetry work and saw them move fly from SFO or from San Francisco to Marin. Um, but they mostly are they're residents in the marshes.
but other rail species do migrate.
Other rail species do migrate. Sora in Virginia, which we do also get in Arrowhead, they do migrate.
Including even the Yuma Ridgway's rail, other subspecies of Ridgway's rail in
That's right.
Southern California and Arizona. That one actually is migratory.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, our guys, the California Ridgway's rail is not.
Oh, one quick
Um,
question before that, Glenn. Sorry, to interrupt here, but John Shribs asked or
oh,
shared that he actually rode with the Spartina project in the spray crew in the Petaluma River. Seemed to be successful, but he asked if there were any updates on the Petaluma Marsh.
On Petaluma, we do still have some hybrid Spartina up there, specifically like the very upper Petaluma River, right where it hits up against Highway 101. We have reduced it a whole bunch. It's not completely gone, but we have uh, successfully been able to stop it. It hasn't been spreading downstream at all. So it's really the remaining amount is really tucked up in the highest, maybe 1 mile stretch. Um, but yeah, Petaluma Marsh itself, that big, expansive, ancient marsh, is largely unimpacted by hybrid because we have not let it take over.
right. Do males and females respond similarly to in the call counts? This is from John Calloway.
Yeah, the early season, we often get duetting clatters, so the males and females call together at the same time. And then as the season progresses, we usually associate kecking birds with the males and keck burrs with the females. Generally, is how they're associated. But
Um, Edwin also asked, what are the natural pollinators for these plants? If we're talking about in Spartina, I can answer that one too. But go ahead.
There, it's like a grass. It's wind mostly, and then it also spreads underground rhizomatously.
Yeah.
And for the transition zone and the marsh gum plant too, it's a number of, butterfly moth, all your typical pollinators.
Bees.
Would think of bees, yeah. Yeah, mostly native bees, right? In the native,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, so the next question is could you explain, it says, please define what the Spartina removal process is. This is a question from Laura.
Okay. Yeah, I think that we actually even have another coworker in the audience, but
Mhm.
very simply, we use an herbicide that is non-toxic. It is approved. It's called a Mazapir. It is approved for wetland use in California. And so we will apply the herbicide uh, at a time that it can stay on the plant for about 4 hours before then getting washed off naturally by the tides. And then it breaks down in UV light and in salt water. We did years and years of water quality testing to make sure there were no impacts from it, and it is doing just fine. Is that enough detail?
It acts on plant-specific pathways, so it's non-toxic to any animals.
Right. And we had tried to go non-chemical route by like say digging, but it just doesn't work. It's a rhizomatous plant, and so it's got these segmented roots basically, and if they break apart, each one of those becomes its own independent plant. So we really tried in a lot of places, but definitely imazapyr has been the most effective and environmentally sound approach that we can do.
I'll follow up on that question. And you guys, how do you apply it? You go into the marsh with the backpack and do it very targeted. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. So we have we go so okay. The program that I manage is the monitoring, like inventory. And so we all go out in the marshes and we very specifically map all of these individual plants that we find, these individual hybrids. And it's all stored in a GIS and we've got our GPS units. We then go back out either on our own, like with a coworker or with a contract crew. And most often they have like a backpack on, and we walk right back to a specific plant and we spray that specific plant, and then we move on to the next one. We do
Sometimes
also
we
use airboats, and so sometimes we're spraying from an airboat where you can pull the boat up, from the water's edge or like from within the channel, and spray that way. We do that typically in our the more infested, the bigger infestations.
we always have a rail biologist out there with the crews. So, and all of our biologists at Olafson are rail biologists. They do the surveys and they know the marshes inside and out. So
Also, I just want to point out that we don't do any of the treatment until the impacts of rail breeding season are done. So we're being very careful to make sure that we're not disturbing any nests or harming any chicks or anything like that, which is why we are all rail biologists to be on the project.
and that is also part of why we do the surveys so that we know where they are. And we take those data on the map out with us in the marsh so that we know where they are.
I have a question. Actually, I have two questions, but the first one is, are there other places in the world? I know that this particular hybrid invasive Spartina is here, but are there other places where there are similar, um, introductions of this exotic Spartina that are causing trouble for birds?
I was just reviewing a paper recently in China. They have Spartina alterniflora, the same one that was introduced here. That's taken, I think they estimated it in 15 years from 2000 to 2015. They've lost like 15% of their shorebird habitat in that short amount of time. And with sea level rise on one side, and yeah, so there's definitely places. Australia is another place that has an invasive Spartina problem. It's a it's a good invader.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And,
even
and
Willapa Bay.
do you share learnings among the communities?
Yep. There have been several Spartina focused forums and conferences. We had crews fly to France. Uh, I was gonna say
20,
1 to 6 years ago. It might
wait,
have been more than
longer than
that.
that. We've also had several like delegations come from China to learn about the Invasive Spartina project, to learn from us how we do our work and how they can take it back there and apply the knowledge that we have. Yeah.
There's one last question in the chat, which I'm not sure is a question that you all can answer because I think it's one that we're all struggling with. But what will happen to those hard-edged urban developments like the airport with sea level rise?
Oh,
Mhm.
Sea level rise adaptation planning. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what's happening, right? Every city,
mm,
every county, every municipality is trying to prepare, trying to figure out what we're going to do. It's a huge problem, and the infrastructure all has got to be raised up or moved.
Oh, good. Somebody else asked the other. I told you I had two questions. The other question I had, which was, how can you tell hybrid Spartina from native?
I mean,
who wants it?
this is we all have our tells. No, there's hybrid tends to grow taller. It has wider leaves, longer leaves, bigger inflorescences. Sometimes it has red. So there's different markers that help us identify whether it's hybrid or native. Um,
If you can picture the fact that Tobias was talking about how it can grow down at much lower elevations than the native Spartina. So the kind of plant traits that are needed to be able to deal with uh, inundation that's longer. So like they're out there and they're underwater longer. So they're just wider, taller, bigger leaves so that they can continue to transpire. They're not drowning. And they have bigger, is it parenchyma tissue? What it's called? Like,
Mhm.
so the stems, that's why the stem has to be bigger so that it can transport the air from way up there out of the water down. Um, so that's those kind of traits.
All right. Seems like we are slowed up on the questions. We have time for like one more. So if you have a question, now's your chance. Whitney, do you have a question for them?
No, I don't have any questions at this time. I'm sure more questions will will arise. Well, actually I do. So, did you mention when treatment was going to start at Arrowhead Marsh? Uh,
Oh, I did not. 2027 is when we are planning on resuming treatment there. So we've got this season, this coming up growing season, and then the one after next summer. Um, yeah.
Uh,
Great.
there was one last question that came in. And is there any way to help the projects through volunteering? And I would say that there is one way, and that is you can join. We once a month are out at MLK Marsh, and we are working in that upland transition zone to
Yeah.
keep it as. So that's a place where we work, and I think and Save the Bay also has some volunteer projects periodically. I can't think of where they're doing it, but you can also help. We're working up at Meeker Slough and other places that are
Yeah.
good rail habitat, and trying to keep the the trash out and all those kinds of things. So I mean, there's no opportunity really to help with the Spartina removal because that is a requires a
Yeah.
licensed applicator and all that.
Right.
But there are lots of other things that you can do, and so check out our website for opportunities. Well, thank you all for talking to us tonight, and we will, I'm sure, keep. I mean, I know that Whitney's in touch with you all and work closely with you as things go forward, and we'll probably have you back for an update in a bit. And to all of you online, thank you for spending your evening with us. I hope you learned something, and if you have further questions, feel free to reach out to us at the office. We'd be happy to help you understand what's going on. So thank you all and have a great
Hey,
evening.
Thank you.
thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank
Yes,
you.
thank you. Good night.
Night,
Bye.
everybody.